It's not difficult to present Cardinal His Grace Angelo Scola, because he is one of the most famous ecclesiastic figures, most esteemed and most sought after for his human and intellectual position, showing that Christianity really is useful, and you can see this immediately. This evening we have asked him to talk about a difficult topic, desiring God. Church and postmodernity. As the most difficult word is modernity is in the title, I looked up this, eating fish with a philosopher and another intellectual, and this is what I've understood about postmodernity through a personal event that happened to me and a citation, which I think give the idea of an important aspect of our times. The episode had to do with my teaching at the Faculty of Medicine. I teach a course which is called Medicine and Society, which introduces young medical students to the cultural aspects of their future profession. And I do this every year. I talk about abortion. I present my position on abortion, which is obviously against abortion. And then I asked a student, what do you think? And he looked at me and said, he didn't say whether he was for or against. He says, everybody thinks and takes the attitude he or she wants. In other words, there's no position. Everything is accepted. I remember when I was in Russia, I was explained one thing, and that is one of the most frequent things that people would say was, whatever, it's all the same to me. Do you like men? Whatever, it's all the same to me. Women, it's all the same to me. Whatever. And then Umberto Eco's citation and quote is perhaps more violent still. From In the Name of the Rose, the theme is prophets and those who are willing to die for truth. Because usually they make many people die with them, before them even, and sometimes in their place they get people to die for them. Perhaps the task of those who call men is to make truth be laughed at, because the only truth is to learn to rid ourselves of the morbid passion for truth. This is the world we live in, and therefore ask what the Church and God has to do with our lives.
Buonasera a tutti. Saluto.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank you very much for this precious, effective introduction that Professor Giancarlo Cesana has made for me. We are longtime friends, and our friendship is being so renewed. I would also like to thank the president of meeting, as she has given me the possibility to speculate on the subject, the desire for God as seen within this great change which is underway. A change which we have termed as postmodernity. I'd like to thank you very much for coming here, so numerous. And I'd like to thank you for the work that you're about to carry out together with me, because listening is a work. And as any work does, it does also involve some degree of effort. I believe that we can make it. Giancarlo started off at 5:10. Well, I believe that by 6:30 we'll all be going to have a drink. Desiring God, Church and postmodernity. First thing, desiring God and reality. I'm sure that many of you have seen Matrix the movie. the movie directed by the two Polish brothers, Wachowski. Cinema is pretty much a lingua franca in our society. It is a formidable medium to investigate truth on the world. It opens up our experience much more effectively than many speeches and many books. Anyway, Patriarch describes our world, our everyday world, but there's an assumption which is put forward. That is that world is, in fact, just a screen to hide the real truth, the truth. And what would that be? What would this reality be? Well, in the film, we learn that mankind survived after a cosmic disaster. And to go on living, mankind needs special machines, and hence men controlling the machines. But these machines eventually prevailed, and the men controlling the machines basically were in power. So the whole of mankind experiences reality very much as they know it, but as a matter of fact, they live in an illusion. Men are not free anymore. Nobody knows how much time has gone by since the time when Matrix, the neurosimulator, has set a specific date to history. It is only Neo, the leading character, together with the Morpheus and beautiful Trinity. Only Neo can discover the truth and help mankind find their freedom again. What is this truth about? Morpheus says so quite clearly, welcoming Neo in his weird hovercraft, fighting for freedom. And the word he says to him are the following: welcome to the real world. Welcome to the real world. Let's think about for a second on this statement, wherein two important elements are to be found. I'd like to talk about desire and the desire for God, most specifically. And I'm thinking about two essential elements. The first is identified by the phrase real world. That is, the truth as it is, the reality as it is. This glass, the mic, the sky, the sea here in the Rimini. These are the reality as my senses perceive them. These are the realities my senses give some hints about, so that my intelligence may recognize them, i.e. the look of those before me, the smile of the children, the face of the beloved, our pleasure in work, the pain with in case of physical illness, the fright of death, the bored anxiety of meaningless leaving. So all the real world, basically. And this is the first element in the phrase. But Morpheus added something to that. There's indeed another decisive factor, which lies in the word welcome. It's good for you, Neo, to be part of the real world. It's good for you, and it's good for all of us. Isn't this the very same meaning of the first smiles of a mom looking at her child? These are the smiles that a child immediately impairs to give back. The meaning of these smiles are indeed, it's beautiful for you to be now in the world. It's beautiful for you. It's good for you. It's good for all of us. No man ever may escape from this experience. This is an experience that is common to the world at large. There's a dynamic which is typical of mankind, and as we identify that with the term desire. Indeed, the word desire may not be understood, and even less so the desire for God, unless we conceive it in this way. And this is not so straightforward, so please do follow me. It implies the tension of the whole of myself to the meeting with the real world. The simple definition that we find in the vocabulary of the word desire is indeed turning. Desiring means turning with affection to something that we do not own and that we like. As you may see, it is very much as if we were a magnet. With two poles, the one cannot be without the other. So, turning with affection, this is what desire is. It implies basically that you turn with affection to something that you don't have and that you like. So you turn to that with affection. This is what desiring implies. So whenever we talk about desire, we don't just refer to a tension of the eye towards some generic idea of infinite. What does God has to do with all of that? Well, I'd like to now to quote something, a very important sentence that is to be found in a book. 1600 years, that was said 1600 years, and the one that has been published more than the Bible excluded. For thou hast made us for thyself, and restless is our heart until it comes to rest in thee. St. Augustine talks about the heart. To talk about the desire, including the two poles as we have identified them, are either I turning to the infinite in the meeting with the total reality. This is what the heart is. The I experiencing this tension towards the infinite. And when I was 20, I learned by Don Giussani what desire means. It means indeed from the stars, de sidera. And the word heart is decisive in the old Holy Scriptures and in all the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the Western world, we cannot use the word heart with all the intention that goes with it. That nature that pushes us to desire great things is the heart. To refer about the essential character of the heart, Friar Giussani used a very harsh word, the word nature. He talked about nature. Well, we may even see that the full nature of desire, turning with desire and affection to all what is real, so the full nature of desire is revealed in each of us by the heart. The heart, therefore, is what enables us to turn with affection to what we do not own, especially so if these things are great things. Is there anything which is greater than God? The reality that cannot be exceeded in greatness, as Anselmo was saying, so much so that you feel restless, that inquietum cor, that your heart is restless, that is deep down. You cannot find peace unless you rest in Him. Desiring God is the great aspiration of man, whether he knows that or not. As we read in the Psalm, your face, Lord, I seek, not hide you your face. As one of the greatest philosophers said, the German philosopher Robert Spemann, even if many think theoretically or many act practically as if God had died, and yet the immortal rumor of God is there. Everybody still talks about God. So why can we not silence this rumor Why are there thousands and thousands of people here thinking and listening to this reflection on the desire of God? Because the profound desire of every man and every woman brings with it, as our daily necessary background noise, this very presence. It is a necessary, central, ever-present background noise. Basically, the reaction comes quite clearly. Without this presence, nobody could tell you, welcome, welcome to the real world. Each man, indeed, identifies with this term, God, the ultimate goal of one's desire, what makes our life worth, even just for 5 minutes. Indeed, God is what makes our life in the real world an asset and not an evil. Now, the second chapter of my speech is, how can we recognize God when He talks to us? Well, the central issue up until modern times was connected to the eclipses and return of God. Well, in postmodernity, this has rewarded, and by the way, you shouldn't be afraid of words. Postmodernity, in its simplest term, implies the new horizon, which is opening up before our eyes after the collapse of the walls. A new world which breaks away from modernity, the past world. And Giancarlo actually quoted two very telling examples about that. So as I was saying, the crucial question that we ask ourselves as postmodern man is not so much, does God exist, but rather it is another one, i.e., how can we hear of God? How can we hear from Him? How can we tell His name for the postmodern man, perceiving Him as something significant and meaningful? This is the great difference between postmodern, modern, and modern. In the Western thinking, which has been heavily affected by Judaism and Christianity, and by Hellenism as well, God, especially so for Judaism and Christianism and Christianity, God is the one who comes to the world. Whenever Jews and Christians refer to God, we know that God is the one that comes to the world. So, if He comes to the world, it implies that it is not the same thing as the world. And yet, this doesn't rule out the possibility that men may meet Him and consider Him familiar. So, to talk to postmodern man about God, an hypothesis has to be put forward, and that is that God Himself comes to the world to make Himself known and recognize Him so that men may tell God is familiar to Him. But before that, we should wonder whether there is any familiarity between God and man, so that God may actually be recognized. This has always been an issue, but it is much more so now in the time of postmodernity. Why is that? Because postmodernity is not interested in general issues on global visions. Postmodernity is much more concentrated on practical issues that are connected to our daily lives, problems such as love, work. So the postmodern man doesn't wonder whether God exists or not, but rather, as He exists, what is His relation to me? Is He familiar to me? Is it good for me that He exists? Well, God made Himself known to man. He made Himself familiar because He came to us, came to our story. And this is part and parcel of Western mindset. The desire of God is something that is intrinsic to all mankind. So over and above all contradicting facts, we should try and find out to what extent the presence of God may be familiar to us on a daily level, so as to meet that need we have, that desire we have, doing away with the unrest that St. Augustine would talk about, renewing for me, for you, for all mankind, under all circumstances and in each relationship at all times throughout our lives, the welcome to the real world. And this is what gives more meaning to the word desire. It is not just a mere subjective aspiration. Desire is actually something that is expressed in the bipolar fullness, the tension of all of ours, the tension towards the infinite. That is indeed God Himself. Third chapter. Let's talk about this familiarity of God with man, which makes us understand that every man God have the same desire for God. The possibility to learn about God, to know that God is with us, and to tell about Him lies in listen to what He said come into the world, to what He wanted to communicate to us when He freely came to the world. Jesus Christ is the way God used to come to us. He was the Son of God. The eternal Word became small as a child. God made Himself small so that we could understand Him, because we are small ourselves. It would have been impossible otherwise to go just over mere knowledge. We would have held different fantasies of God, different images of God, but He made Himself small so that we could understand Him. So, to say God, you have to learn the language of the creature, of the Word that made Himself flesh, that so as we could understand Him. So we have to understand this grammar, this language that we share. We have to understand the grammar, again, of this language, because that is the grammar that enables us to tell us about God. So follow me, please. It is not just only going to be the Christian that may be able to confess Him as his Lord and God, but every man, even the one who is a self-styled non-believer. So every man will be able to recognize Him, at least following the words of St. Paul in the letters to the Romans. As it's written, God is the one who hath quickened the death, and calleth those things which be not as though they were. He is the Creator. He is creating me while I'm talking about Him to you. He is the Creator and is also the Saviour. In the first chapter of the same letter to the Romans, the Apostle had stated that we all have to recognize what can be known about God, because God Himself has shown it. For His invisible attributes, and again I'm reading St. Paul's, namely, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Let's think about this. What can be known about God? This is something that all men can know, irrespective of the Christian faith. We might not know everything about God, but what can be known about God is available to us all. We may not know everything about God, but what can be known about God is available for all of us. Here, therefore, we learn about God. We can welcome, listen to the word of God who is amongst us, and we can talk about him. And this is very relevant also to the condition of the postmodern man. So basically, we have to learn the grammar of the language with which God talked to us. So we should consider the central places of man experience where this relationship of familiarity with God is visible and is continuously present. He has become man. He made himself a man so as to make himself familiar to us. These are the places where the old men try to satisfy the deep nature of their heart. I would now like to outline 3 of these places where we can detect this familiarity of God with man, and when we realize this desire for God. I'm not going to talk about desire in abstract terms, because I would reduce that to our subjective aspirations. But I'm going to analyze it in the tangible making of our daily life. The first of these places, the first element of the grammar of this language, is the human experience in all its simplicity, and I'm going to describe that. Memento is a movie directed by Nolan of the year 2000. The leading character, Leonard Shelby, trying to save his wife from criminals, is severely hit at the head. Such trauma impairs his ability to store recent memories. All recent content, all his most recent memories basically disappears by his mind just a few minutes after they have been experienced. So he can only remember what happened before the accident took place. So he knows where he comes from, he knows how to deal with daily life, as eating, driving, writing. But as soon as he's driving a car, he doesn't know why he's in the car at all. And when he walks into a restaurant, he doesn't remember why he walked in. If he meets up with a person that he has recently met, he doesn't remember meeting that person at all. After the accident actually remained the only memory. So since the accident, the only objective of his life is to find the man who has raped and killed his wife. So Leonard basically is taking notes obsessively, writing down everything, and most important things are translated into tattoos on his body. And then he takes Polaroid photos of all what may turn out to be useful for his task, and i.e. finding the killer, because he knows that in a few minutes he's going to forget what he has just seen or what the person who has just met. This is a film that a friend showed me recently. That's why I'm quoting it. So this film, I believe, describes effectively a relevant element in our lifestyle as postmodern men. This style life is often confused as a desire to meet the knowledge of the real world. As Leonard in Memento, we also live a fragmented life. A life which is full of plenty of information, knowledge, so much so that we have to tackle some aspect of our life. It is as if we have forgotten all the rest. We deal with all the rest as if it didn't exist. Basically, we just refer to different logics, rather experience, as if they were all independent one from the other, as if they weren't connected one with the other. Why is that? Well, because they are not part and parcel of an comprehensive system. We behave as if we didn't have an existential hypothesis making us able to interpret the real as one thing, to meet up with the real life. We are obsessed to details and willing even to have tattoos in our heart. And this is why we basically rely on the memory of the new media that can store a lot of images. But this is not the real memory. This is not the memory of the man. Hence, at times ethic experience prevailed, or some other times the logical experience prevailed, or the economic experience, or the technical experience prevails, or the artistic logic, or the political logic, and so on and so forth. So we have different elements prevailing, each one separate from the rest. But we cannot hold everything in a comprehensive approach. It is a bit as if we had lost the possibility to hold the memory of the recent past. And now we're going back to the subject, this desire for God, the common grammar between man and God. This leads us always remembering the unsinkable grammar of mankind, through which God, that has mixed up with history, is still giving us signs of his presence amongst us. I am with you. I am here. It's not a coincidence that at the end of the film, Leonard states, I need to trust in a real world that is outside from my mind. I have to be persuaded that my action still have a meaning, even though I can't remember what it is. I have to be persuaded that even if I shut my eyes, the rest of the world is still there. So, considering all potential objections that may derive from the complexity of the postmodern man lives, we have to close with an important consideration made by Karol Wojtyła. And yet, there's something that may be termed as the common experience of mankind, and yet implies basically to run counter to postmodernity, according to which apparently there's no common experience for mankind. And yet, says Karol Wojtyła, and yet there's something that may be termed as common experience of mankind. What is this? Well, here we find a convergence with the Catholic doctrine of man. Human nature, though wounded by the original sin, was never totally corrupted down to losing its essential traits. As this is never going to happen, because God, after the original sin, hasn't just forgotten the world, neither the mankind. So this common experience is still there. This is intrinsic to the condition of man, and this bears witness again to the fact that God exists. And God basically is reassuring us. He's telling us that He is here with us. Let me go back again to the concept of the common experience. What is the primary content of this? What is the primary idea? What is the prime element of this grammar of the language which is shared in common by man and God? We are given the possibility to host the real, which is revealed as intelligible. Man, with his reason, may therefore see the truth, which is one thing with what is good and what is beautiful. And then I would like to add to that reason includes reality and is intimately connected with the will. And this is the nature of the heart. Reason and will together in the relationship with the reality. Knowledge and affection are therefore joined together, and this is something which is intrinsic to all mankind. And through this structure, the real world is offered to us, providing us with amazement and wonder, and sends us back over and above what we might see, what we may see, to identify God who's talking to us. So we may easily understand that is indeed God is the ultimate implication of every human experience. This is the human experience, allowing every man to recognize every morning and to start again every morning, facing different situations and different relationship with a constructive approach. This is what Memento stands for. This is the memory. It is not the obsession with writing down things or trying to include all potential details, with details being magnified as if they were a computer file, leaving as Leonard did with all these fragments, forgetting all the rest that is all essential for our existence. Memory is the bond between the past and the future, which is made available by the fact that the person may always meet up the real world. He lends a ear to his heart. This morning I looked at the exhibition on mathematics, and if you look at that exhibition, you may easily understand what I'm referring to.
Verità. Non ci sarebbe scienza.
There is no science. There wouldn't be science if we weren't able to look at it this way. This common experience for every man, this first and fundamental place of the communication and narration of God, has two radically important implications. The first, what does this tell us? It tells us and gives us the awareness that God is not elsewhere. God came into the world. God is not elsewhere, but is inside, is in the depths of reality. And this in the precise sense that God has set this up here and now. He has created it, making it part of himself. The world, it has been made by him. A God outside reality would be a mere product of our imagination. It would be a void name, as very often men of today say. When they ask, they don't deny the existence of God. They treat it neutrally as if were an uncommunicable quid which can't be known by all men. Whatever question and discussion on the genesis of life, the Big Bang or whatever, if it is completely compatible with this affirmation that is completely compatible with this affirmation, God, the world was made by him. The second place, the fact that God is a part of us. If God is part of reality, if he is the ultimate implication of the common human experience, well then it follows that no man, absolutely no man, is distant and far away from God. Nor, whether he like it or not, can he in any way distance himself from God, not because blasphemy is not a tragic option, but because the negation of God will imply always censor and refusal of one's whole and elementary human nature. And therefore, as long as I live, perforce, I recognize that God is here. And on this basis of a common human experience, in describing the gratuitous intervention of the revelation in Christ, St. John, therefore, can say, in truth, he came to that which was his own. The whole of the human family, he came to that which was his own. The second element of the grammar I have entitled I, and then dash in dash relationship. The I in relationship. The grammar of the language in which I communicate the word that was made flesh and into a creature has very many other essential elements, and we can see these which are very familiar because this is part of the common experience of every person. In other words, if each of us thinks a little bit, what do we discover? We discover that, first of all, I can say I, because I am one. I am the same person that I was when I was a child, and now I'm 68. But I am one only in a dual sense, because inside this one there was two things, soul and body. If I haven't digested, I find it difficult to speak. If my wife suffers, I can't eat. Again, these two poles exist in my unity. One in man and woman. I always have in that one person the feminine part of mine, which is me, which is not, in my case, accessible because I'm a man. And then again, we have the other duality, that of person and community here too. It's like two poles of the same magnet. So the unity of man is marked by an insuppressible dramatic tension, which always casts into question our freedom with every act. And this experience that is common to us all is another narration of God, God speaking of himself. Now, I'd like to stop a couple of seconds with regard to the last of the three elements of this duality, person and community, because our era is marked by individualism, which is very marked. There's always been individualism. But in postmodernism, this era of ours has put the accent on this, and this makes human relations very fragile. It breaks this duality, and it makes fragile the transmission of the meaning of life from one generation to another. This transmission is no longer lived through as an obvious legacy of humankind. A French author, very interesting that I discovered this summer, called Giancarlo, wrote something called Le recul de la mort. And the fact that in the West the age of life expectancy has gone up very quickly, this has had the effect that the son has become in the collective imagination and in the experience of the couple, the child has become the product of an individual and the product of a reduced desire, if you like, an aspiration which very often is just that of a whim. Now, the grave consequence of this fact has meant that gradually there has been a change in the very perception that we have of ourselves, and that the I has of himself. We are no longer called upon to be part of the generational chain, but especially we want to achieve our independence, our individuality. We no longer consider first and foremost as being part of a series of rights and duties, but rather we see ourselves as a part of a weave of whims and aspirations, which are very inconsistent. And however, we consider these as unquestionable rights, as much as we consider as necessary the reductive desire which led to my very coming into existence. So everything, in fact, is undermined by this pretense. If I'm the subject of your subjective desires, therefore, why shouldn't I, in turn, do exactly as I please, as my whim takes me? So especially in this area, do we see the invocation of the return to God, knowing God, thanks to the patient reconstruction of good relationships from the most infinite and spontaneous to the more indirect and institutional relationships within which we must learn to live and carry out good via virtuous acts, because education is not just a question of proclaiming values. As he who was at the beginning of all this meeting showed, it's not just a question of teaching. One has to put one's words into practice. Don Giussani was the first to teach us this. And here we see the testimony that God renders the experience of man. This is also possible in the fragmented, individualist world of today. Yet again, we can make recourse to another film that I liked to have an idea. And here I'm referring to the masterpiece, Brother, Where Art Thou? Now, in the title of this film, we are told that the film takes its cue from the Odyssey. Three prison inmates break out of prison looking for a hidden treasure. It's an on-the-road film with a modern tinge. We have Odysseus, Everett, Delmar, and Pete, and they meet an old blind man, and he says that they won't find the hoped for $1 million, but things will end when they see a cow on a roof. That's very odd. But along the road, which is a symbol of our road of life, they discover various traits of the human people, which are seen and narrated in a series of scenes and people. But at the end of the day, Odysseus finds his wife Penelope with 6 children, she was about to get married to somebody else. But anyway, they set up a house again, and then they come across people who are about to be killed by the Ku Klux Klan, and then, in fact, then there's a flood, and suddenly what they see as a result of the flood, a cow sitting on a roof. At the end, Odysseus says to his wife, Penelope, everything is okay. And the chatterbox Odysseus explains to America about many things that happened, the depression, stupidity, desire, and hope. And we see at the end a family with 6 children, dignity, respect, and freedom over and above human fragility. And again, Odysseus of the Coen brothers, the people who made this film, is looking for answers. Only some answers are given. This is him and man asking the question. And among thousands of contradictions, we see that we have this duality of body and soul, man and woman, and person and community. So the real name of the I is not I, it's I hyphen inner relationship. And this is something that I would like to coin. I will never write I just by itself. I will write I dash in dash relationship. Now, all this presentation that I've just read in bits and pieces, but we are, in fact, in the avant-garde in Venice. But anyway, all of it, the whole of the text, you will find on the website. Thank you. So at least we've had a little bit of rest. I mean, I have really tried to be very simple because I always have criticism laid at my door. Isn't he difficult? He always speaks in such a difficult way. I really have made a big effort this time. But I'd like to tell you a secret. Taking my cue from a sentence of a great philosopher, Hegel, and he always talked about the difficulty of concept, the toil of concept. You know why? Not because I don't have this limit, but when one talks and one talks in a difficult way, very often it's because we want to hear things that we already know. When we hear things that we don't know about and we have to toil to conceive it, well, things become difficult. But anyway, apart from this self-defense, let me continue. This is perhaps my key point, because I think this gives an idea of the sense of a Christian life, which comes at in my last paragraph. I'd like to point out that at least one fragment of this simple human experience, living in relationships, resists in every situation, just as the ability to host reality on the part of reason always exists and resists. At least a part of it and a fragment of this exists. And it's starting from this fragment that one can always go back and find the experience of desire in integrum. I'm going to go back to this question of starting from the fragment later. Every desire that weaves the daily plot of human experience puts us further and further back beyond its particular content, because every circumstance, every relationship constitutes for man a reminder. It's just one little step which rekindles St. Augustine's cor equiatum, restless heart, and makes it tend and have attention towards God. In fact, Homer said all men need the gods. This is the reason why the Church considers the authentic desires of man as valid allies for the annunciation of Jesus Christ. And indeed, Jesus Christ promised happiness and full freedom. Come, follow me. If you come, follow me and thou shalt be free. This is what Jesus said. In fact, there is no time like our time. There is never has there been such a moment to prove the truth of this. The Gomez Davila, the genius, wrote, "It's not sensuality that distances people from God, but abstraction." Now, let us look at a third rule of this grammar with which God becomes familiar to us. And I've called it this way: the quest or the application for salvation and redemption. This aspect looks at a question which has always been linked to the question about God and his presence in the world. This is a question about our human fragility, and especially with regard to evil, especially with regard to sin. In other words, evil committed by me. The evil which separates us, which destroys, which breaks that unity, as the history of the 20th century has shown, with its tragic utopias which have only made the dark of the eclipse of God even darker. But here too, the fact that very often is set aside is that the human experience of fragility and sufferance is not the last word. It's always crossed and impinged upon by the demand and the supplication for salvation and redemption. It doesn't matter how this redemption is imagined or described. Some people, ingeniously wrong, continue to see this as the fruit of their own efforts, as a sort of self-help, treating themselves as a new Prometheus. Others, listening to the sirens of certain advertisement that comes from an erroneous reading of the Far East, see this as a flight from reality. And indeed, many, especially in our times, have tried to think that we just live and that's it. The problem of salvation and redemption does not exist. And yet their desire always comes to the fore. Perhaps, indeed, the quest for salvation and redemption is where we see most clearly that salvation and redemption are the fruit of a gift, and we see its gratuity. And as a result, we must recognize absolutely the possibility of mercy and forgiveness, which is the spring which keeps together my unity as a person and my unity with people. The moral figure, moral which is achieved is not impeccability, but that of picking up. And this is made possible by forgiveness, thanks to God, that has become familiar to us. The more we go on, sin gives an acute pain, but it's not an alternative for life if you listen to this God with us. And therefore, the quest for salvation is a part and parcel of this grammar. And therefore you will see that the desire becomes concrete. It is not just an aspiration, a subjective aspiration. The heart is not just a subjective desire. It's experience in action, in my relation with you, with God, with everything, in which this becomes a reality. And therefore, the manifestation of salvation and redemption is the gesture of Jesus Christ on the cross, who, innocent, offered himself to the Father in the unity of the Holy Spirit to reconcile the world with God. The signs that we practice are very clear, that we practice every day, and which remind man of this salvation and this redemption, from the contemplated cross right through the sacraments and the memorials of the Eucharist and the various other gestures that we can carry out in various other parts of our life. From the forgiveness and the sins of man, we can all find this desire that we all yearn to, as we see in the many cultural and artistic aspirations and expressions that every civilization has produced. Looking at Christ, looking at the glorious cross, is the invitation that we must remind ourselves to do, and we must propose to every one of our fellow brothers. But even those who don't live their faith in Christ carries with him this indestructible desire for salvation and redemption. There is no religion in the world that does not talk about salvation and redemption. This is part and parcel of the grammar of the language in which God speaks. The experience of full mercy, the glorious cross, constitutes the apex of experience, but an experience that each man can have. And in fact, being a man who has been forgiven, by that same token, man does not have to self-justify and justify himself by negating the evil which has been committed. Evil is evil and nothing can justify it. And yet sin, whose destructive power is obvious to all, is not the only and the last word to be said about man. This is recognized, and he can ask for forgiveness. Man is not, in the ultimate instance, defined by the desperate evidence of his ill and his but is defined rather by his desire for salvation. This implies the defeat of every utopian or totalitarian attempt and temptation, because this helps us to understand that we don't give ourselves over to absolute evil, because every definitive judgment is left to the only judge of history. And also because it allows for redemption to be asked for. And this is a gift and is not the outcome of any presumption on the part of man to set himself up, but to create perfect systems whereby no one ever again needs to be good. Now let's do the last passage. It's not that short. And I have entitled this, anyway, we're going to finish on time, even beforehand, The Life as a Testimony. The path we accomplish, what does it lead us to? We have tried to outline the conditions to meet again this religious quest in a postmodern era to meet God. It is the occasion, the opportunity, because the question, where am I, where I'm going, where have I come from, what happens after death, this is all a possibility for us to meet God again, which at the end of the day is God of Jesus Christ. And these conditions are decisive, both in terms of content and method. Let me sum up the contents, first of all. I've presented them in a very summary manner. We have outlined three. These are the three parts of the whole presentation that God and man practice together. First of all, man, reason and freedom, can understand and take into himself the truth, and so that reality becomes intelligible. Suffice it to see a sunset. In every human act, we can touch at first hand the desire for good, for truth, for the one, for beautiful, and we perceive that it is this desire that moves freedom. This fact, and I said in its simplicity, describes the whole and elementary human experience of each and every member of mankind. Secondly, the nature of the subject is a relational one. Relations don't come afterwards. It's part and parcel of the nature of man, because the I is always in relation to. And this is the full human subject, because the person is unity, but is always a part of a duality, body and soul, man, woman, person, community. Third, the unity of the I, which is fragile by its very nature and undermined by the experience of evil, calls out for salvation and redemption. And forgiveness answers this quest, forgiveness which out of mercy reconstitutes the unity with God, reconstitutes the unity of I with God. In other words, these three conditions of human existence help us to look at the person of the Word incarnate as the Savior and Redeemer. And he leads us to the Father, his Father and our Father, so that our hearts as creatures can gradually go from restlessness to the restfulness in heaven, which is already anticipated down here. This is why God came into the world, and therefore this justifies the interests that we have in the historical person of Jesus Christ by a contemporary man. Never, as in these days, has the figure of Jesus Christ been so written about. And following this interest in Jesus Christ, one learns that gymnastics of desire, that's the expression of St. Augustine, the gymnastics of desire which leads to God. Why? Why? Because in Jesus Christ, the desire to meet man is there. It's in his heart. And here we come to an important point, the interest in a new man, which we are, and we want to communicate to our brothers. Without an interest for a new man, the interest of Christ would remain in books. It would remain in abstract. But at the same time, we see an interest for Christ, without which an interest for man would be an empty shell. If I have understood in my experience, the charisma of Don Giussani is that this interest for, and this was the key to Don Giussani, and this is increasingly urgent and compelling today for educators as well. It is a decisive point, especially today, but in my view, unfortunately, it is increasingly less put forward, and therefore there is the risk of no longer appreciating how precious this interest for Christ and for man is, and how important it is to faith. In our path, which is a final path, we have followed a method that I'd like to take a bit further. I introduce it like this. What is the method inaugurated by God to make himself known to us, to speak to us, and to make himself known in our human language? It is the method of the faithful witness, as Revelation calls Jesus Christ, Revelation 1:5. The faithful witness, he who loves, because he has loved us first and loves us in every instant, as if it were our last instant. And if we don't have even the slightest experience of this before, loving before without asking for anything in exchange, loving as if it was our last moment, well, we have never felt love. And if Christ came to bear witness to the truth, well, then man must bear witness to him, the living truth and personal truth. And this we must do in our meetings with our brothers, even if this encounter and counter exists in the word encounter, even if we have this shock of the difficulty to bring Christ into the human history. And however, we must never be fearful of this, never, especially if we Christians set aside the desire for hegemony, and we see our difference and present it with humility and as a tenacious and public proposal. In this way, man will be able to rediscover the insuppressible desire for God in the language in which we can understand today. And 3 examples of the language I have given you in the 3 films. In fact, the desire of God is like the phoenix. It is born again from its ashes. Now, this is seen very well in the final word of another great film, ends the film, The Concert, when she talks about her desire to meet her natural parents that she had never known. This film, in fact, is very emotional, and it involves the viewer very much. It's a desire for redemption, just like in the opening up to the infinite that one realizes, and which is seen in the film by the beautiful music. A famous violinist admits and says, I look for the gaze, and I have looked for the gaze of my children since I was a child. I look for their gaze everywhere in the road, and when I play, I'd like to see their gaze upon me. Just for an instant, just for an instant. This is the elementary form of the desire of God in everyday life. It inhabits the heart of man always. In the case of the character of the concert, it is seen in the painful search for her true parents. The gift of faith in God is seen when, by grace, a person finds the road to God. So, where does this faith come from? It comes from us through the Church. Our title talks of the Church and postmodernity, and it's not by chance that the title is such. And we haven't talked about Christianity. And I did this because I wanted to recall the concrete historical dimension of this. I mean, I exist, you exist, John exists, Andrea exists. Christianity doesn't exist. What exists is a community of brothers, which is documentable. The Church is alive and always holy, over and above the sins, sometimes terrible sins of its personnel, as Maritain called them. But the Church, as a Christian personal community subject, has to be seen as such. To say it in the word of Guardini, the Church is that which takes place and inhabits souls, the people, because it is holy, because it always is the gift of redemption. Now, the Church, this subject, a community, can propose, even in a complex plural society like ours, can propose the advent of Christ in all its implications, certain and contingent, anthropological, social, and cosmological. Why can it do this? It can do this because Christ is inside. It is God made flesh in our everyday life. And starting from these implications, I repeat, we have described three. Every man in grace and in freedom can work up to the explicit recognition of Jesus Christ. And as St. Augustine says, the way, the truth, and the life. And therefore, as a result, the Church requires faithful witnesses. The Church demands a radical change in mindset, in the practice and conception of life, according to the words of Maximus the Confessor. He said, for example, I think that he who has somebody who thinks according to Christ, but sees Christ in all things, has the intellect of Christ. Last Sunday, for example, as he says, we saw this loving God, but in everything, not something which is just there and then everyday life is outside, not having the doctrine and that's it, the rule and that's it. One has to love God in everything and above all things. To think according to Him, to have the intellect of Christ, is to think according to Him and through all things, because everything is yours. This was so well said by Maximus the Confessor. All is yours, but you are of Christ, and Christ is God. So this is the complete dynamic of the grammar. However, very last point, one has to free the category of testimony from the moral weight that oppresses it. Today, testimony is oppressed by moralism and reduces it simply to the good example of a subject that is always self-referential. So people talk well about you, but this you doesn't lead to Christ. The testimony is brilliant and shines out in its full integrity as a method. In other words, as a practice of knowledge. And here we go back to the 3 points. A practice of knowledge and communication of the truth. And this is what testimony really should be. This is the fertile ground from which all other forms of knowledge and communication spring, be this scientific, philosophical, theoretical, or artistic knowledge and communication. So, in essence, I'd like to give an example of this. We can all live testimony as a practical method of knowledge and communication of the truth. Visiting a very severely ill person, there are about 12 people around, and the priest introduced an elderly person to me and said, "Your Grace, this old person, in fact, has looked after his handicapped boy who died only last week. He was 52, and he looked after him all these years." This is something which, in fact, leaves you askance. We said a few words. I don't remember. I said, "God will give you merit for this." And he said, "No, Your Grace, God has already given me everything because I have learned what love is." What does that mean? It means that he knew reality and he communicated to others, to his patriarch. This is true testimony. And therefore, in essence,
consiste la testimonianza.
So, in essence, Christian testimony is the objective following of Jesus, having the courage to recognize him before the world as he did when he was called to judgment by Pontius Pilate. He says, "I have been called to bear witness to the truth." So the church, directly or indirectly, becomes an indispensable condition to desire God, because it is only testimony, the faithful testimony will move the other and will invite him to make that decision to go to Christ. The church, the place of the testimony to God, is the community which allows for this testimony to take place every day as a method. Come and see. They wanted to come familiar to him.
Familiarità.
The grammar of being familiar. Come and see. Come and see. Come, friend, you who work with me. A schoolmate whom I had lost sight of and for many, many years, you who've lost your son, you who are living this wonderful experience of love with your fiancé, come and see. I, in relation, not a man reduced purely to an experiment of himself. But how do I learn this? First of all, through the Eucharist and the liturgy, the first place of a familiar love of God, the experience of a knowledge and a flavor which will become knowledge, the generation of a new people, the people of the Lord, a community in which we can all say with our defects and I am no longer I who live, because I have the same sentiments as Christ. The church that every morning on waking up with the simple sign of the cross repeats a greeting full of hope. Welcome to the world, real world, every morning. This I have to keep within my time. I've just got 1 minute left. This church, which allows us to have the most exalting and the most universal of human experiences, desiring God, is there. Even for postmodern man, even the greatest of scientists always desires God. This experience, however, cannot be carried out in solitude, alone, as an extreme adventure on the sheer rock wall of life, or as a solitary crossing of the ocean. It's not a heroic solitary crossing, and nor can it be carried out fully in communities that remain self-referential. This experience can only ever be carried out in a community with our brother man, whoever that brother man is, and whatever condition he is in. Our brother man, who every day in thousands of ways of our existence comes to greet us and to meet us. And here we see who the faithful witness is. And so this is really what I want to say. The witness is that person who, sharing in person even the last fragment of desire, which always lives and is kindled in man. That film, the person who wanted to see her natural parents, there's always this fragment which remains, and therefore the faithful witness will share that and will go for that fragment, and proposing the beautiful way of life that Christ has suggested will kindle in that other person the desire to know God explicitly. In other words, to accomplish his real desire for happiness. And this yearning, my dear friends, has a simple and luminous name. It is called holiness. Thank you.
Ringrazio.
Thank you, Jogeris, on behalf of all of us. We've learned quite a number of things tonight. We've learned that cardinals, when they are on the holiday, and they're always working in the way, they watch movies. At least 4. The second thing we've learned is that you could watch a movie with a different attitude, as you can watch with different attitude also to reality. Indeed, many of us have watched the movies that you've named, but not all of us did come to the same conclusions. The third thing that we've learned is that there's quite a lot ahead of us. We have to learn this grammar, the grammar of relationship, of looking at our neighbor. Well, this is a work that we want to start. We've started tonight. We want to carry it out during the day and during the life. And this is what the meeting done, because when he was just Angelo, a priest, he was close to us. He was close at the beginning of the meeting. And he had quoted St. Paul stating that we cannot get to know all about God, but what we may know may be known by all of us. And this is what the meeting stands for, in fact. Thank you.